off.
No sweat.
All right, I think we are ready to get started. Let me double check, make sure we're live. All right. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Leah Say. I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for today's conversations about emerging leaders and diversity, equity, and inclusion in public relations. A little bit of information about myself for those of you who don't know me. I am a crisis and issues media spokesperson at Amazon. I've been at Amazon for a little over a month now. Prior to Amazon, I started my career at General Motors, where I had the opportunity to work in quite a few different parts of the business. I started in Washington, D.C., working in public policy communications. I then moved back to Detroit to headquarters, where I was working on product and brand communications for Buick, GMC, and Chevrolet. And then eventually I started working at a plant doing manufacturing communications. I feel like I've had the opportunity to build a really great relationship with the Planck Center over the last few years. For me, that relationship began in 2015 when I was a graduate assistant when I was working on my master's at the University of Alabama, and just had a wonderful connection with the Planck Center and the mission and what Betsy was really trying to do in our industry. And since then, I've been able to stay connected with the Planck Center. Thankfully, they have not gotten rid of me yet. So I stick around for as long as I can. I currently serve on the Emerging Leaders Committee. We're a group of young professionals that serve the board and the Planck Center in a variety of different ways, one of which is through resource guides that our team works on. So shameless plug, if you were on the Planck Center website and you're looking for awesome free resources, including this webinar series, you can check the free resources section under webinars and take a look at what they have going on. And I would also say, if you did not have the opportunity to listen to the first section of the first webinar of this series, incredibly powerful. Go take a look at it. The panelists and moderators did a wonderful job of really setting the tone and setting the stage for this conversation. So if you hadn't had a chance to listen to it, please do. And before I pass it over to our awesome panelists to start today's conversation and introduce themselves, I'd just like to thank the Planck Center for having me and having all of us. This conversation is really important one for us to be having. So thank you to Dr. Carla Gower, to the board, and also to Dr. Nilanjana Bardam and Pat Ford for really chairing and championing the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So with that, if you are watching live and you want to start to ask our panelists questions, go ahead and start typing in your questions throughout the conversation as we're talking. And at the end of the conversation, we'll go back and we'll start asking and answering your questions to the panelists. But with that, I will turn it over to the great team that's with me here today. So Cedric, if you'd like to take it over, I'll hand it to you.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Cedric Brown, APR. I've been in public relations, marketing, and communications for about 9 years. I started out my career in Detroit, which is where I'm from. While balancing full-time work, I was doing some volunteer freelancing for local youth serving organizations in my hometown. After those 4 years, I decided to pursue a master's degree in public relations from the highly esteemed SI Newhouse School of Public Communications at Syracuse University. And through my connections and some of the people that I met during my classes, I was able to relocate to D.C. And tomorrow it'll be 4 years since I've been into the area. Right now, I'm focusing my career on providing digital communications for purpose-driven organizations. But in my spare time, I write for the Public Relations Society of America's monthly membership newsletter called Strategies and Tactics. My column covers diversity and inclusion related issues. I also serve as a founding board member for the Public Relations and Communications Association, which is based in the United Kingdom. It's one of the founding board members of the Race and Ethnicity Equity Board. And then finally, I've had some writings for the PR News and other trade publications. That's a little bit about me. I'll pass it over to Carmela.
Thanks, Cedric, and thanks, Leah. My name is Carmela Glover. I am currently the Executive Director of the Diversity Action Alliance. I actually started my career in chemical engineering, working in pharma, health, and beauty sectors for companies like Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and L'Oreal most recently. I transitioned into public relations just because I noticed the power of communication. I realized I also was an engineer by trade, and without having the proper fundamental education, I didn't think that moving into communications would be as seamless. I also went back and got my master's in public relations at New York University in New York, and that's how I came into public relations and networking with those in New York to find the PRSA Foundation and ultimately Diversity Action Alliance. Denville?
Yeah, I will follow up those two amazing introductions. So thank you to the Planck Center for this amazing series and just for inviting us to come on and share our perspective during such a, an important time for the industry. So a little bit about me. My name is Denville Hay. I'm an account supervisor at ProSec Partners, which is a global integrated marketing and communications agency that's headquartered in New York. And during my time with the firm, I've had the opportunity to just get involved in a number of industry projects related to diversity and inclusion, from the launch of Diverse Voices to supporting the Diversity Action Alliance under Carmela's awesome leadership, along with Pat Ford. So, those opportunities have really given me the chance to kind of expand my understanding of diversity and inclusion and some of the issues and potential opportunities in the industry, and looking forward to kind of unpacking all that with this panel today. So excited to be here.
Great, thank you all. Now, before we really dive deep into the conversation of all things DE&I, I think it's really important for us as a group with the audience to kind of level set what DE&I is. I think we all hear the terms. Sometimes they're heard and seen interchangeably, but they really mean different things. So when thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, how should we as a group and with the audience be distinguishing among them? And what are different kinds of efforts that are required from leaders to really help advance us with each of these three? And anyone can take it.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Cedric.
All right, fine. So the way I see it, and I'm going to say diversity, inclusion, and equity because it kind of follows that kind of leadership step. So diversity is really counting who's in the room. And a lot of times when we're talking about these efforts, people are focused on diversity and just making sure that they have somebody represented from different groups. But the next step to take after that is inclusion. And so that's making sure people really have a seat at the table. But at the same time, you're not really putting a time limit or considerations on how often people get to speak and whose voice is the loudest at the table. So now we're working towards equity, where we're making sure that everyone's voice is able to be heard at the table equally. And so there's no unequal balance of power in between those.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Denville, were you going to say something?
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with Cedric, right? I kind of think about diversity, inclusion, and equity as kind of steps along a journey, if you will, right? And I think that diversity is definitely sort of that necessary first step. But in a lot of senses, I think it is also kind of table stakes at this point, right? I think we've all kind of seen the marketing and communications pitfalls that companies have kind of found themselves in because they don't have, diverse representation at the table, kind of helping to shape the story and shape the narrative. But as we all know, diversity definitely doesn't mean inclusion, and it definitely doesn't mean an equitable environment, right? So that definitely is kind of step one. Inclusion, as Cedric mentioned, I think is kind of where we start to be a little bit more thoughtful about how people feel when they come into an organization, right? And that's really important because, you can have a very diverse group, but if sort of the marginalized identities within that group don't really feel compelled to speak up, or people aren't listening to them, that can have a really big impact on sort of the culture of inclusion and definitely, creativity, innovation. Like we've seen a ton of studies about this stuff. But for me, where I think that, I've seen an area where the industry can use a lot of work is really on that equity point, right? Because to me, equity is all about kind of ensuring everyone has access to the same opportunity. And I think to do that, it's going to require us to, be cognizant that we don't all kind of come from and start at the same place, right? And, we all have our differences, whether they're socioeconomic, cultural, whatever they may be. Those differences can impact the opportunities that we ultimately get access to, right? And I think it's important for us to realize that, a lack of opportunity doesn't necessarily mean a lack of ability, and we need to be willing to kind of take chances on people that haven't been given the opportunities to kind of develop those abilities. So that's kind of how I think about them as steps along the journey, and definitely I think if we keep in mind kind of what the goal is, Cedric, as you mentioned, like a lot of times people focus very heavily on the data, right? And I think if we do that, we never kind of move past that first step. But if we're able to kind of think more holistically about the employee experience and what that looks like within an organization, I think then we start to think a lot more about that sort of inclusion and equity point as well.
Agreed. And I think just to add to those points, I think the reason why equity is usually the harder step and the last step is because without that inclusion piece, sometimes equity becomes invisible. Equality is different from equity in that it's easy to see when something is unfairly happening because it's just, this is not fair. This person has 10 projects and I only have 5. That's something that's very easy to quantify. But equity is often invisible. It's often something that if you're not experiencing it, it's something you can't see. And it takes that inclusion for people to feel comfortable, that culture of, I feel like my voice is valued, to be able to speak up and say, this is what's happening in this organization that's inequitable. So without that inclusion piece, a lot of times inequity is, it gets swept under the rug or it just doesn't get noticed at all. So completely agree with you both there, and that equity is that final and last piece. And organizations that are a little bit more in the infancy of their diversity and inclusion journey are really focusing on the recruitment and the diversity numbers and making sure they have a culture of inclusion. And once they get there, they can really elevate by focusing in on equity.
Yeah, completely agree, Carmela. I'm so glad that you pointed out kind of the differences with equity, because I feel like when you're looking at diversity and inclusion, sometimes equity, that piece is just complicated for people to understand. So thank you for explaining it in the way that you did. So now if I could just switch gears for a little bit and talk about our roles as emerging leaders with DE&I. When I think about myself as a professional, and not only a Black professional, but also just a professional in the PR industry, I feel this sense of responsibility to have crucial conversations, not only for the industry as it stands today, but also for those that are coming behind us, right? The next generation, those that we're paving the way for. And I'm sure that some of you all, if all of you all share similar thoughts. So I wanted to ask you all, the emerging leaders of today are the industry leaders of tomorrow. Do you think that they have a specific role or roles to play when it comes to DE&I? And can you think of any stories or examples that you'd like to illustrate to maybe help the audience understand a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of kick this one off. Leah, I 100% agree with you. I think that we absolutely do have a role, right? I think that, as I think about the role that I can play and sort of the role as emerging leaders more broadly, I think that it really is to kind of, especially during this time, to kind of serve as this, trusted advisor and sort of like an additional conscience, if you will, for leaders as they kind of figure out how they're supposed to be responding and their organization is supposed to be evolving to address issues of diversity and inclusion, right? And even issues of broader, systemic injustices more broadly, right? I think as those that are kind of on the front lines of culture and media and, employee engagement in the way that work gets done, I think it's important for us to kind of serve as the ambassadors within the PR industry to really help leaders kind of understand how public expectations of their brands really needs to be integrated into their communication strategy and even more broadly their business strategy, right? I think we need to be the ones that are saying, you can't keep silent on certain things anymore. Even if you don't have the perfect thing to say, you need to be out there saying something. And if you are going to say something, be sure that you're kind of addressing the issues head on and really talking about the role that our organization can play in addressing some of these issues, right? Because that's what the public is demanding right now. That's what this generation that's coming up is really looking for, right? They're looking for that authenticity, that accountability, that personability, right? They're looking for a deeper understanding of things through shared experience, and they want to understand how they can make things better as well. And all of those kind of elements need to be interwoven into our communications if you want to resonate with the public in a way that, you know, that really sticks. And you know, I feel like especially now that can be uncomfortable for emerging leaders, especially diverse emerging leaders, right? In a lot of ways, we're forced to have conversations that we've never had before with folks that we've never had before during a time that's very emotionally taxing, right? We were just talking about this a little bit before we joined on here. But if I could ask, I think anything of the emerging leaders, I would say, you know, take this point where we are in history and really lean in on this, you know, expertise that you have, that is your perspective as someone on the cusp of this next generation, right? Because that's super important right now in advancing the conversation. And for leaders, I would say the same thing, you know, invite emerging leaders to the table, listen to what they have to say. It may sound bold, it may sound, you know, like you're moving in a different direction, but in a lot of ways, it's indicative of kind of the sentiments of society. So I definitely think we have a role there, and that's kind of where I see it.
I agree. I mean, I think emerging leaders have a responsibility to, you know, at this point in their careers, find your voice and then make use of it. You know, be courageous. You know, overcome the fears that you have about having uncomfortable conversations, because uncomfortable conversations are really just the start. That's just the beginning of it, because then after that comes the actions that need to follow. So I think we have a responsibility to challenge the status quo, of course, in a respectful and tactful way. And part of the reason why we are emerging leaders is because we have figured out how to work successfully within our organizations and within our industry. And we need to have confidence in that and recognize that, you know, we can manage up as well. And that, you know, that counsel doesn't always fall on deaf ears, especially when you know how to frame it. I mean, you've been doing your job, you're communications professional. You can make the case for what's important. And then you can relate it to the business. And, you know, it's absolutely a business imperative at this point. I think most organizations know that. So there's no reason to have any fear at this point. So use your voice, make noise, and use that as your platform, because you do have a platform where you sit.
Yeah, you both have brought up good points. I'm thankful personally for the organizations that have given me the opportunity to leverage my voice and talk about a little bit of my experiences with DNI and just in the workplace in general. And it's even more appreciative how I haven't really had my voice censored or really had it silenced. I've been able to kind of authentically communicate. And that's really what's important here is we can't keep tiptoeing around issues anymore. You take a page out of Ben and Jerry's book when they wrote the statement about Black Lives Matter. Every company and organization had to put out something. But Ben and Jerry's was one of the few that didn't really tiptoe around the issues. They didn't tiptoe. Talking about systemic racism and how many of our problems, even related to PR, go back to the 400 plus years of practices. Even after slavery, it's housing discrimination, school discrimination, just the general lack of access to opportunities. And I'm just thankful that we're making very slow progress to being more comfortable not tiptoeing around the issues anymore. That's really what the role of an emerging leader is.
Yeah, and I think that's 100%, Cedric. That's a great point. Leah, if I could just go back and just add one point too, because you made a point about sort of the generation coming up under us, right? And I think that, you know, that relates back to the inclusion point, right? I think that it is incumbent upon us to really bring junior employees, especially, you know, diverse employees, into the fold, right? And be that sort of layer of the organization that really creates that inclusive environment, right? And that involves investing your time in younger people, right? It involves giving them the tips and the support that they need to reach their full potential, right? Being someone that they feel comfortable confiding in, and someone that helps to build their confidence so that they feel comfortable sharing their ideas and like bringing their views to the table, right? Give them room to fail and like learn without fear of isolation and fear of sort of, you know, being too harshly judged as like a punishment, right? Especially for employees of color, because I feel like there is a real pressure to perform when you're sort of in that kind of like marginalized group. And it's important that, at our level, we're really making the difference there. And I'll even give you an example, right? Like really early in my career, when I was still an intern, I struggled, and I almost didn't make it, right? I was almost not allowed to kind of move through the intern program. And if it wasn't for an emerging leader who happened to be diverse, actually, and believed in my ability and kind of advocated for me and like advocated as to why I sort of needed another chance to kind of prove myself and kind of turn things around and invested that time. And in doing so, was able to kind of rally other emerging leaders and other people around that kind of mission to kind of help Denver move along. I think that, I might have not been here. And as I think about my career, I feel like that will always sort of be a defining moment for me, because it could have made the difference between, me sitting here now and not. And I don't think that enough people that look like me or come from a similar background as me get that same level of nurturing. So I think as emerging leaders, we can make a really big difference there too.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with everything you were saying. And Denville, one of the things that you were mentioning earlier that I wanted to go back to was really the responsibility of leaders, always, but especially during this time, to really be championing and DEI and holding team members accountable and measuring success and all those things. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit, going off of that, and dive a little deeper into the responsibility of leaders. So for the panel, what traits do you all think that a leader dedicated to DE&I should possess, and how can these traits help in advancing DE&I in the PR profession?
I can kick this one off. I think there's quite a few of those traits that you also would like to see in emerging leaders that you'd like to see elevated in your chief diversity officers or your DE&I leads. And courage is definitely one of them, because you're going to have the difficult conversations. You're going to have to ask for investments. You're going to have to ask for or give the bad reports of here's where we are and it doesn't look good. But I think one really good trait of DE&I leaders, or good traits that I've seen in great DEI leaders, is strategists. Like Peter Drucker has famously said that culture eats strategy for breakfast. But at the end of the day, when you're trying to make a change in diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's got to come not just from the bottom, but from the top. And a good DE&I leader can reason and level with everyone from a board member to an intern. So they've got to be in touch. They've got to be someone who knows what's going on, who knows the business. I say there have to be three types of people. They've got to be a PR person or a communications person, a business person, and a people person. So they have to be well-rounded, because they need to be able to speak to the structures within the organization that need to be dismantled because they're inherently biased, right? And maybe they've been that way since the inception of the business. Maybe it's a global business, and you need to really help those in the headquarters who may not be necessarily in the same place that you are. So chief diversity officers, I think, are more common in the US. But how do you communicate the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is really it's really big and relevant in the US. How do you communicate that to a European headquarters who doesn't have the same necessarily concerns, right? So you've got to be courageous. You've got to be in touch with what's going on. And you've got to be a business person. So while culture is important, it's not the only piece of the diversity, equity, and inclusion job. You've got to be able to look through the systems that you have, the recruitment, the hiring, the promotion and advancement, like what systems are inherently inequitable and only allowing for certain groups of people to be promoted or to be promoted at a certain frequency or rate. So I mean, aside from that, I would say they need to be a really engaged leader. It's got to be a labor of love, truly. I mean, everybody doesn't have to love the job that they're in to be good at it. But I think to be a good DE&I leader, you really have to have some empathy, care about people, be courageous. And I think the more important question actually is are you working for an organization that thinks that DE&I is as important as you do? Because if you're working for a group where the diversity officer is really just there to be a face and to give lip service and to say we're doing something, but there's not real investments happening. The council of the chief diversity officer is not being taken seriously. I mean, similar to the other C-suite positions, I think a chief diversity officer, if they're going to be effective, they need to have accountability metrics. They need to be reporting to the CEO, and their goals need to be tied to business outcomes. Because I think this is that serious. It's no different than any other business unit that's important to a business operating. You know, I used to work for a company where when we wanted to do business in a new country, you would send the employee to learn that language, learn that country's culture and what they're like, is it normal to shake hands there? But do we do that well right within our own organizations? Do we get to know what different types of people make up our organizations and how we can succeed as an organization? We go out and we do this in other countries, just, you know, to make sure that we can establish business there and we have some local partners. But are we doing that at home to really understand every stakeholder and every employee that we have and to make sure that our messaging resonates with them? I think that's a good DE&I leader is going to help focus on that.
Carmela, you brought up some pretty good points. You brought up a lot of good points. I think all of this, everybody's fear and the lack of advancement towards DE&I, it really just comes down to fear, honestly. And so the trait that I would say that leaders need to have is just being fearless. Back in June, July, I wrote this blog post for PRCA talking about if you really want to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter, then you have to get over your fears. Because that's really, it comes down to fear because our white colleagues, let's just be honest about it, are often not comfortable giving an opportunity or not comfortable working with somebody that doesn't look like them, hasn't communicated like them, and doesn't share their same experiences. A D&I or DE&I leader will understand that not everyone's going to be the same, but you can find the differences in everyone to put together a puzzle that leads to success for the organization. And it's not just about semantics, but it's also making sure that the clients you serve, the people and the publics you serve are also better because of your diverse and inclusive perspectives. So as far as the leadership types of styles, this type of leader is transformational because they can get people to really buy into their vision. And they're also participative in that they give everyone an equal voice to help make decisions and help lead the organization to where they believe it should go.
I just want to go back really quick and add something you said, Cedric, made me think about it. I think another really good trait of any leader, really, but especially of a DE&I leader, is continuous learning, because there's always going to be something. We all have bias, and there's always going to be something that we have a blind spot to. So being genuinely curious about the different types of people that there are in your organization, that there are in your consumer base, and always wanting to learn that. I mean, DE&I is transforming all the time. We learn new vocabulary words all the time. There are new ways to define things that make them more clear. And having an open mind, I think, is something that a really excellent DE&I leader has. I mean, if you think about how just in the last 50 years, terminology has changed. Let's say specifically for the African-American population, we were called Negroes just in the 60s. And then it moved to Black, and then it moved to African-American. And now we have BIPOC, right? Black and Indigenous people of color. So there's always something new to learn. There's always a new perspective. And so while we, sit in our corporate America boxes, there's always research being done to uncover new things. And I think a good DE&I officer or leader is always learning, I'm always reading a book. And I think that every person who's a leader in any industry should always be reading and learning and just consuming something new. Because you can always have new and fresh ideas come out of that, and you can learn something new every day. So that's one thing I wanted to add from something you said, Cedric.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we just heard two incredible perspectives on that. And I mean, I agree with everything you guys said. I think if I were to add on to that, I would say that, I feel that a D&I leader definitely has to be someone that, is a great partner, right? And can kind of bring all those pieces together within an organization. I think, if you're looking to make a measurable improvement across recruitment, retention, and representation within your organization, like that's going to be a pretty tall order for any one department, much less one person, right? So you need to be someone that can work well with kind of the various business units to move the needle more effectively and move the needle in a way that's not like painstakingly slow, right? Whether that's working with HR on recruitment strategies and making sure that you're diversifying the pipeline and putting certain metrics in place and making sure that you're hitting those metrics, whether it's working with direct line managers, right, to make sure that that culture of inclusion is really being kind of built at that mid-level and really bolstering the retention of your organization, or even like partnering and working with IT, right, to make sure that you have the right systems and programs and things in place to really support and scale your D&I programs. All of that requires partnership, and all of that requires bringing multiple pieces together. And Carmela, you made a really good point that kind of relates to this. It's all about the communication, right? I think that you can be a really great DE&I leader. You can, put the work in, you can put the systems in place, you can even hit all your metrics and goals. But if you're not kind of effectively communicating that to all of the, constituents within the organization and explaining to them how they can kind of be a part of the movement, it's going to be hard. And you have to make sure that you're definitely doing that with employees, right? Because they're definitely like your key stakeholder in all of this. And if you're not effectively communicating to them, it's going to be hard for them to sort of rally behind it and really get invested in kind of, the purpose of what you're doing. And I think that that's where us as communicators, we kind of have a leg up because, we're naturally storytellers, right? And we naturally take people from point A to point B and kind of tell them why we're doing this and what's the strategy and what's the potential outcomes and everything like that. And we need to be able to do that with our organization and kind of bring them along the journey that we're on as it kind of relates to DE&I, right? Essentially, you're in the business of change management, influencing change. As you mentioned, Cedric, like being transformative, and a big part of that is the communication element. So I think that being a really solid partner and being an expert communicator are really two traits that are imperative for a DE&I leader.
Agreed. Because if your employees don't buy in, then 9 times out of 10, your clients aren't either, or your consumer base isn't either. So I think that's important. Good point, Stemple.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you. I have nothing else to add to that one. I feel you all did a great job with that. Carmela, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, and I want to go back to for the group, was the fact that there's, in addition to systemic racism, there are also a lot of structural biases within organizations that don't really allow us to move forward in the DE&I space. So one of the things that I wanted to ask you all as a panel, maybe we can talk a little bit about it with the audience, is let me figure out where I was. Sorry about that. Well, all right, I'm back. What obstacles are there that are currently in place that for D&I in the industry, and what can we be doing about those obstacles to move the industry forward?
Yeah. So I'd like to take this time to talk about my story a little bit. So in 2014, I'd ran through 4 full-time jobs for various reasons. And as I mentioned before, I was freelancing on the side with an emphasis on free with local community groups, but that was my only true PR experience. And I thought PR was just simply writing press releases and managing social media. I thought that landing press hits was just all there was to it. But I really wanted a PR job in my native Detroit. But the obstacles and the feedback that I would keep getting is just that I didn't have an educational background in it. They wanted somebody with more experience. we can bring you on, but it'd have to be as an unpaid intern. And those were popular back in Detroit because, you know, our city got hit really hard by the Great Recession in the late 2000s. And at that point, I didn't have transportation, so I'm gonna go get free work experience without a car? Not quite. But ultimately, you know, I decided I really wanted to do PR. And if I couldn't get the further experiences from working in an actual environment, then I decided to go to grad school. So I had to break the lease on my apartment, go live with my mom for 4 months before moving to Syracuse, packing my car with as much as it could be packed. I drove a Mercury Sable, which is a small car, and just relocated to the good old Syracuse, New York. But when I got there, I knew that that was really only half the work. And so I leveraged that opportunity to really connect with the correct people, because I knew that I wanted to take my career to DC. So it really involved me listening to what some of my elders were saying, taking that advice and taking those next steps. But essentially, in order for me to get to Washington, D.C. in September of 2016, and for me to really be here right now, I had to take on a financial burden of leaving home. I also had to find the financial burden to be able to relocate to a new city. I had to go get an education formally in PR. And then also I had to find and meet the right people that could help me get to where I wanted to go. Black people, and really people of all colors, go through similar barriers like this every day to get to the places we want to go. And it's sad. And it really just stems from 400 years of systemic racism. People think that racism ended after slavery was abolished in 1865. No, that's not true. Slavery just has been refined over the years, to be honest. That's why we have prisons now. And it definitely didn't go away when we elected Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. So as a profession, we need our allies with power, and I've written about this. We need the people that have the most power to break down those barriers, find ways to provide opportunities to people in underrepresented groups. And then it's not just providing them scraps. You have to really believe, like Denville and Carmela were saying, you have to really believe that they can do the job that you brought them on to do. If you're just using them as tokens to show off, oh, we care about diversity. Look at this one Black intern that we have. He's very unhappy though, and we're not going to keep him beyond 3 months. That's not diversity at all. You have to have a true commitment to keeping people, to developing people. Your goal ultimately should be that any employee that leaves your organization should be able to benefit another company. They should leave your place better than what you found it. So that's kind of what I'm saying. It's just, we have to remove the systemic racist barriers by providing equity, essentially.
Completely agree. Now, I would definitely agree with that, Cedric. And I would say that some of the biggest barriers and obstacles are the illusion that by hiring a diversity professional, or by doing a diversity campaign, or by recruiting one time from an HBCU or a Hispanic serving institution, that we've done everything we need to do. And I think just checking the box, or checking the box when you get to a crisis and you've made an extremely egregious mistake in your communications, and now you need to do some diversity training. So I think diversity needs to be weaved into everything that an organization does, not just something that we do in good times or in a crisis. It needs to be something that you can sustain even when you're having a bad quarter or a bad year or an economic downturn, because the rest of the business keeps running even when you're having a bad year or a bad quarter or it's an economic downturn. And the investments that you make throughout your business should include DE&I. It shouldn't just be a box that's checked one time, or when it's popular, you know, when someone in the media is screaming about your organization, or when something happens in your community. it's not a passing thing. It's not something that can just be taken advantage of at this point in time. And I think the obstacle is the illusion that we do care about diversity because we did this one thing, as opposed to we actually care about diversity because we've weaved it into everything that we do. It's one of our core values, and we consider it in every decision that we make. Because there are other core values. There's honesty, there's integrity, there's a lot of core values that people pull into their company compasses. And if DE&I isn't constantly there in some way, shape, or form, affecting every business unit, function, and decision, that's a big obstacle, and that is systemic. That's something that comes from an organization that has been built on something that didn't consider all of its key stakeholders.
Yeah, no, I mean, you guys, you hit the nail right on the head in a lot of the things you said. And I mean, I tend to agree. I often feel that there are a number of challenges, but as it relates to what you guys were saying before, I think, that lack of sort of dedicated mentorship of young, diverse talent, right? And I'm not really talking about at like that, emerging leader levels, as I was talking before. I really mean at like the senior levels of an organization, right? I think a lot of times, diverse employees often get kind of left out on the fringes in terms of access to knowledge and access to people and access to projects and things like that are really going to help to kind of move their career forward. And, I feel like this one kind of hits home for me a little bit because, in my experience, I've actually been quite blessed, I feel, to have worked with people who have always kind of given me the opportunities to try and kind of nurture that talent. And it's like a bit disheartening that I feel like other people don't always get those opportunities, right? And I think it goes back to that equity point we were talking about before, that, we don't all kind of have the same path, right? Like I was lucky enough, when I was an undergrad to be able to take a number of unpaid internships, right? And that ultimately set me up to get my first gig in the industry when the time came. And that doesn't mean that I was necessarily much more able than, other people that didn't have those experiences. It just means that I was given an opportunity that others may not have been given. And I think that that's really important. And it really is somewhere where I think senior leaders need to look at, the people that are in their organization and think about, how those individuals feel that are not of the majority, and figure out how you can kind of bring them into the fold and really help them kind of advance their career. The second place I think that we tend to have an issue is around kind of the specificity of diversity, right? I think a lot of times diversity gets used as a euphemism because we don't want to really talk about the issues at hand, and we don't want to specifically say what the problems are, right? And I think that can create a lot of issues in terms of, being accurate in what our goals are and holding ourselves accountable to those goals, right? A lot of times we hear organizations say, we want to diversify upper management. We're working to diversify upper management. But very often will they say, we're looking to add X amount of Black talent to upper management and, Latinx and Asian American talent to upper management. And I think that vagueness makes it very easy to kind of put D&I on the back burner, right? There was a really interesting CNBC segment where Melody Hobson, who's the I believe she's the co-CEO of Ariel Investments, she was basically talking about how, diversity and inclusion is always something that we seem to be working towards, right? We're never working towards increasing sales or increasing revenues. It's either you do or you don't. And if you don't, most times someone's out of a job. But diversity, it always kind of seems to be this like ongoing thing that we're working towards. Yeah, maybe we get it this time, maybe we don't, but we're working on it, I think that we just need to be a lot more specific about where we want to go, and really just call things for what it is, and it'll make holding ourselves accountable a lot easier.
I agree. I'd also just like to point out something that I think we end up dancing around a lot, but diversity, equity, inclusion is not going to happen everywhere. It isn't. It's not everybody. It's not on everyone's agenda. There are, quite frankly, people who resent policies like affirmative action. There are people who don't think it's important, and they maybe lack diversity in their company, but their company's still doing really well and they don't see a need for it. Just the way there are some organizations who don't agree with stakeholder capitalism, don't think that the purpose of a corporation should be to serve all of their stakeholders and not just their shareholders, in primacy, right? So it's not going to work everywhere. You can't push it on everyone. And I think that's something that's difficult for us to talk about, because we live in sometimes in our bubbles where, we know it's the right thing to do. There's a growing body of work that says it's a business imperative, but it's not going to happen everywhere and at every business, or in every organization. It's not going to be on the top of the agenda at every organization. And those organizations, maybe they'll survive and maybe they won't. But you have to be able to identify in the place that you work, is it the right place for you? It's not always easy to do at the entry level or even at the mid-management level, to identify, is this the place for me? But enough experiences will let you know. And that's not just coming from being racially diverse. I mean, there are many other ways in which you can be discriminated as a woman, as a person with disabilities, and realize that, it's not going to change, especially if the organization does nothing to address it. And even if they are working toward it, it's something that they should be communicating. So if you're not hearing anything about it, and there's a general feeling of this place is not for me, I think you should trust that instinct. A lot of folks talk about the obstacles and barriers, but you can talk to your blue in the face, but some people and some organizations will just have to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
I definitely want to add this point, bro. So you bring up the good point of not everyone's going to want to do diversity and inclusion. The other pitfall that we all need to be mindful of is don't pigeonhole your people of color into diversity and inclusion related roles, and don't approach them as if you're entitled to an answer on how systemic racism works. There's a common quote out there that mentions, like, it's not the job of the oppressed to educate the oppressor. You can see that as an extreme, or you could really take that for what it is. We have enough responsibilities on our plate as underrepresented professionals. And the last burden that we really need is to feel like we speak up on behalf of everyone that looks like us. And that's not true. There's different strokes for different folks, basically. And not all skin folk are kinfolk too. So every Black person is not the same. And you just don't put that pressure on us. Ask us if we want to. And if we don't, then you just have to respect it.
I like the point on every kinfolk is not necessarily skinfolk. And the reason why I like that is because probably the best diversity and inclusion training I've been to was when I was working at Procter & Gamble, and I was a part of the African American Leadership Network. And we went on a retreat, and it was all African American entry-level employees for the most part. And we did diversity training, and all of us are sitting around laughing like, oh, we're the African American Leadership Network. What are they going to teach us about diversity? And we learned a lot about diversity that day. And one of the key things that we learned was that we are not all the same. We may all have, brown skin, but we come from different backgrounds. We're all different. And so I think that's another level of complexity when it comes down to, addressing our stakeholders and our employee concerns. We're not all the same. And I think it's very important that a good leader reaches out to their employees and their stakeholders to understand what their concerns are. And it's going to be different for every company, and it's not going to be the same for every Black person or every Asian person. So I even appreciate that Denville and Cedric's stories are different, because there's nothing similar about how you came through your undergraduate experience, but one person may look at you too and say that you're two of the same, two different sides of the same coin, excuse me, and you're not. And so I think there's a lot to unpack. That's why I say being a diversity professional is not easy. It's not all about just making a nice, fun, cozy culture where everyone can come to work and be themselves. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and a lot of data and a lot of research and a lot of strategizing. So I appreciate both of your points.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree with you. And I'm glad that, Carmel, I'm glad that we're having this conversation now, because you're completely right. If we don't have these conversations, which are often difficult and challenging, a lot of people will just assume that we're all the same, and we're not. We all have different experiences. We all have different thoughts. We all feel differently. So I'm glad that even now, even with the audience, even though we can't directly talk to them or they can't directly talk to us, I'm glad that we're having this conversation to really advance that. So I'm going to ask you all a final question on my end, and then I want to save a little bit of time from questions for the audience. So I know our conversation has kind of been in a variety of different places. We started out at a very high level of what is DE&I, and then we dove a little deeper into some of the obstacles. But I want to kind of end our conversation with thinking about progress and thinking about mentorship and thinking about what we can really do for folks in the next generation. Actually, let me take that back. When I think about mentorship, not even just folks under us, it could be peer mentorship. It could be mentoring folks above you, whatever mentorship looks like to you all. My final question is, what role do you think that mentorship plays in advancing DE&I and PR?
Yeah, I can kick things off with that one. I think, going back to the last point I was making about, just bringing people into the fold that are on the fringes. I think that mentorship is, it's critical, right? Especially as we think about junior kind of employees of color who are, navigating corporate America and don't really have a lot of people to kind of lean on that look like them, right? And can really relate to the experiences that they've had. And I think, mentorship, to your point, Leia, it goes both ways, right? It's helping junior people kind of along and again reach their full potential, but it's also kind of, helping change the perspectives of senior people too, right? And helping them understand kind of the current sentiment. And that is a form of mentorship, right? We should feel that we have that responsibility and we have that ability to enact change in that way. Especially during this time, I think a lot of people are, open to hearing what people have to say and open to learning and open to understanding. And we kind of need to just lean into that and take advantage of that right now and really be those mentors, up and down the career spectrum.
I agree. I agree that mentorship is critical. I think mentorship is something that can really help to break down those inequities, because there's not always someone in my family who has the experience in corporate America or, in public relations or in communications. I mean, even outside of the industry. I mean, I definitely believe in having a mentor within your organization, but also outside of your organization who can provide some really unbiased and objective perspective. I think mentorship is critical, absolutely, especially when you're in the early stages of your career. But even for those of us who are mentors, just understanding what's happening as we escalate up the corporate ladder. Sometimes you lose a sense of what it's like to be, kind of in the boots, they say, on the ground and doing the dirty work, especially when you get more into strategy and away from a lot of the tactical work. You need someone to kind of be your grounder, someone who's going to tell you this is what's happening on my end and to point out some of those inequities. So I think mentorship is critical, from grooming someone and developing them and teaching them how to get to that point and just bringing someone along with you. I think it's everyone's responsibility. Anyone who who is even 2 years into their career, bring somebody along with you. Explain to them how you moved from this very small account to this really major account in 2 years. You know what I mean? I think it's critical in breaking down barriers. That's one of the obstacles of inequity.
I absolutely would not be here if I didn't have 20 different mentors in my Rolodex or virtual Rolodex. But not only that, I also have a handful of sponsors, and sponsors are those people that actively advocate for you at the big time stages. And so when I talk about that, I've had sponsors who've helped me and introduced me to some of the big players and some of the more powerful individuals in DC. And that really helped open the doors for me to be able to get a second chance at a PR career here. And finally, there's also executive coaches that we also have to keep in mind. So the three levels of it are mentors who can kind of bounce ideas off of you and you can learn and be groomed. There's sponsors who actively take that big step in speaking up on your behalf for career opportunities. And then there's executive coaches, which is what you pay for, and they help to groom you too.
Cedric, I'm so glad you brought up sponsorship, because a lot of times we have conversations about mentorship, but forget that sponsorship is really a key piece to career development and growth. So thank you very much for bringing that up. Now, for audience members, a lot of them have brought up some really good questions. Unfortunately, we're only going to have the opportunity to go through a few of them, but I wanted to at least pose some of them. So one of the questions that you all received was, how can we publicly navigate communication topics surrounding racial inequity, DEI, and more in the workplace? And whoever wants to take it can take it.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of go first. I mean, I think the number one thing is to lead with authenticity, right? Just to be super authentic in all of your communications. I don't think that people are always expecting you to have the right answer or solve the problem right away. But I think it's just, about being very open and honest about what the issues are and sort of how you're going to address them and holding yourself accountable to that. Carmela, you made a point earlier that was talking about, sometimes you'll look at the data and you'll see that there's problems all over the place, right? And that's the first step, is kind of acknowledging those problems. And you need to be authentic in communicating those problems too, right? So I would just say that as you continue to kind of navigate, diversity and inclusion and even broader issues, just kind of be authentic, stay true to your brand, but definitely be authentic in terms of what you're saying and how you're communicating the issues and the way that you are looking to address them.
I agree with that. And I would say, when things happen in the community, for example, right now, we're grappling with the shooting of unarmed Black men. It's not an opportunity for your organization to speak out and say, we care about racism and we stand with it. It's not just a standing moment. So leading with authenticity is important. It should be something that is a part of, if it's a part of your brand, then it should be a part of your brand year round. It should almost be like an evergreen campaign. Like, it's just always something that's there, not just when it's an opportune time to make sure that you're resonating with all the stakeholders. I mean, you should always be trying to resonate with all stakeholders. I think when you put out messages about what's happening only when something bad goes wrong, again, when you're responding to a crisis, that's not always the best time to say something. Sometimes it's when everything seems like it's okay. I mean, we're really not in a post-racial society. So there's always an opportunity to talk about what you care about and espouse your values throughout the year, not just when something happens. And so it comes off as inauthentic when companies make a statement right after someone gets shot or right after their organization gets caught red-handed doing something that's racist or that offends people with disabilities or that offends the LGBTQ community. That's not the time to make your response, unless you're going to be able to back it up with, here are all the things that we've done throughout the year. Here are the things that we're planning to do. And like Denville said, it's not always going to be a rosy, pretty picture, but as long as you're authentic about it and you plan to have sustained action behind those words, I don't think a reasonable person would be offended by you saying something in that period of time.
My response would just be, the first step to solving a problem is recognizing that you have one authentically. And so if you're willing to take that very first step of getting out of your comfort zone, of being a more diverse and inclusive workplace, there are tons of resources out there. There are tons of consultants out there that can help you achieve that if you're really interested. But just be mindful and just be sure it's something you're really ready to do. You don't want to fork out thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars for a D&I coach when You don't even want to say hello to your all Black finance staff in the morning. That's really happened because that's not authentic. But find resource guides that can help you talk about racial justice. Look up HP. They recently did a campaign where they focused on the struggles that Black professionals face in the workplace, and they tied it to a business objective of becoming more diverse and inclusive. So just find the resources out there.
That's great. I'm glad that you all touched on the theme of authenticity. You all can't see it, but in the chat on Facebook, we're getting a lot of questions and comments about authenticity. One of them was actually, what's a good example that you've seen of an organization that's shown authenticity? So Cedric, I'm really glad that you kind of called that out with HP, even though you didn't see the question. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. So I'll now move to our final question, and we had one come in from the audience. Do you all as a panel have any advice for current students on DE&I?
Yep, just be yourselves. It's really that simple. If you're going to start interviewing at a place, you want to find an employer that's going to allow you to be who you are within reason. Now, there's a difference between authenticity and being a professional. You have to kind of walk that line. But yeah, you just find somebody that's going to accept you the way you are. And you can really tell with your gut and just by the types of questions that you ask in your interviews. And just kind of follow your intuition. And if you see any yellow flags, red flags, then that's probably not the place for you.
I would also say, even if you're not a student of color, be curious, be unafraid and unashamed to ask questions when you don't know, and be open-minded. Again, be yourself, no matter what color you are, be yourself, be authentically you, be outspoken about the things that you care about. Just from research and from articles that have come out, Generation Z and younger millennials are not, they're unashamed about espousing their values and saying what matters to them. But you use those values that you have in your interviews. It's not just an interview of the company trying to see, if you're a good candidate. You want to see if you're working for a company that you want to work for as well. And diversity, equity, inclusion is not going anywhere. It's something that has been a topic for decades. It's not going anywhere. So educate yourself about it. It's important. It's not just a passing trend of something that's come up and it's going to go away when something else comes. This is something that's important for everyone to know, and everyone to be educated about. So be curious about those around you. Always be willing to learn more and do more and put something behind your words. Make sure you put actions behind it. Nothing has ever, I'd like to add that nothing has ever happened in the workplace without those who are young and fiery and passionate and eager, making a noise and taking a stand. And like Cedric said, obviously in a professional way, to toe the line between authenticity and professional. You're still in a place of work, a place of business. But that fire and that passion is never more and never burning more intensely than when you're a young professional and you have the energy and the time to dedicate to those things that you care about, outside of the business context.
Yeah, no, those are all amazing points. I completely agree. Be yourself, be open. If you're not a diverse, student, be open to understanding kind of the experiences of your diverse colleagues, right? That's huge. And also just be confident in yourself, especially, the diverse students, as you start to kind of find your way and go into the professional world. Try not to doubt yourself and doubt your abilities and really understand that you guys are kind of the next generation, right? You have a voice. You are also in a lot of ways going to dictate what the country looks like and thinks like over the next couple decades. And that is your power, right? You may not be, have 20 years in the industry, but you do have a perspective of being, alive and relevant and a young person during this time, and having to kind of be involved in those conversations that are happening. And that perspective is really huge.
Yeah, that's great. I think that is such a a great place to end this conversation. Be passionate, you know, be yourself. And I love Carmela said, don't be afraid to make noise and take a stand. I think that is absolutely wonderful. And I feel like I'll be using that a lot. Thank you to our panelists for all of your wisdom and insight today. I feel like every time I have conversations like this, I feel like I learn something different and learn something new and hear a different perspective that I didn't know before. So thank you for that. You've been incredibly valuable to the Planck Center and the board. Thank you so much for having us. And I don't think earlier I shouted out Will Bradley, who is a UA student who is helping us from the Planck Center, working on all things Facebook and tech. So Will, if I didn't shout you out earlier, thank you so much for everything you're doing behind the scenes. You're very valuable and important. For those of you who joined us today, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. And if you're interested in learning more about the Planck Center, you can visit planckcenter.ua.edu. This webinar will be on the site under the free resources webinar section. It will also be shared and archived on the Planck Center's Facebook page as well as YouTube page. So thank you all so much again for this conversation, and I look forward to more in the series.
You all.
All right. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Take care.